Alright guys, welcome back to the Harvath channel. This video is all about mapping and routes. So if you are interested in learning my tips and tricks for how to set up and plan a path for you and your animals, whether that's for a day, a week, a month, we're going to go over my tools and resources, not to mention some helpful information for setting boots on the ground or hooves on the ground to be able to go and do a trip. We're going to go over all that in this video. So if you guys are just interested in figuring out ways to find more places for you and your horses to go explore for a day, or you're looking at doing a long distance pack trip, or you just want to know how I planned a 6,000 mile plus horseback journey going 5-6 days a week on the trail, 20 miles a day in places I'd never been before, we're going to cover all those things here in this video. Now, for those that are unfamiliar with the Year of the Mustang journey and my background in this subject, I'm going to explain a little bit. On December 5th of 2024, I returned from a 6,000 mile ride with my 3 Mustang horses, where we went across the entire country, almost Utah to New Jersey. So from Heber City all the way to Middletown, where we touched the Atlantic Ocean, and then we took a different route all the way back to Heber City, Utah, passing through 25 states. This brought me through many diverse environments, many different regulations, laws, locations, all sorts of different situations when it comes to where me and my horses were actually riding to make the distance every day. So that's where some of this information is coming from, and this will apply to people who are just wanting to get out and find new places to go on a ride with their horse, to people who are looking to do long distance horse travel. Now, if you guys are unfamiliar with these concepts of planning a long distance horseback journey, I recommend going out and checking this video first, where I go over 5 questions you need to answer to be able to plan a long distance trip with your horses, and that will be able to help and go along with this video. All right guys, so I'm now going to go over 3 principles that I want you to think about throughout this entire video, because they're going to apply to everything I'm talking about. Number 1 is the map is not real life, okay? I don't care how good your satellite imagery is. I don't care if you got 3D view of cities and streets and all these things. You've got the best topographical map. All this stuff helps. It's all a great tool to implement, but the map is not real life. The real experience is always more to handle, and there's things you are never going to be able to know if you are going into new territory and unfamiliar places, and even if you're going into familiar places. The map is not real life. All right, number 2 has to do with going into country that you are not familiar with. So going into areas that you and your horses have never been before. Take it from someone who went into areas he's never been to before every single day for over a year. You have to minimize those mistakes of having to turn around. Yes, I've had to turn around a few times, and it hurts when you have to do that. So obtaining the very best information that you can beforehand to be able to minimize those mistakes. A lot of those shortcuts you think you see on the map are not existent in real life. And on the flip side, in real life, sometimes you're going to find shortcuts you never knew were there. So the same is true for both sides, but obtaining the very best information you can beforehand so you can make the best decisions for you and your horses while you are on your ride. All right, number 3 is know your goals and know the big picture. This doesn't really apply to those who are doing day rides, just trying to get back to the trailer before it gets dark. This has more to do with the people and riders who are trying to span out over a couple of days or weeks or months. They have goals of where they're trying to get to, places they're trying to be. And my suggestion to go along with this, as far as seeing the big picture, you need to break it down into increments. If you are going for months, break it down into weeks, and then into days. So for weeks, see what you want to accomplish within that week. Where are you starting, and where would you like to be at the end of that week? If you are just going for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, say, break it all down into days. Where would you like to be at the end of each day, ideally? And this will all tie into some other things we're going to talk about later in this video. Now I'm going to give you guys an example of the big picture related to the Year of the Mustang journey. Now, I knew my goal, which was to pass through as many states as possible while going from Utah all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and back. So I had some parameters that I had to fit there. I had to build my trip and my initial route around those parameters. I also had the goal of doing the entirety of the trip without trailering my horses for the sake of travel. That means I couldn't run into any obstacles that would require me to get picked up and driven over them. This, as you can imagine, brought lots of additional challenges. Now, my journey took me over a year to accomplish, so that immediately brought up an inherent question of weather and seasons and where I would be at certain times of year. For example, I spent the entirety of the first winter passing through states like Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri, while I spent most of the summer passing through the Northeast and Midwestern states. Deciding when I wanted to leave and when I wanted to get back, as well as where I would be at what time of year, were major factors in determining the route of the Year of the Mustang journey. Now, one way this might show up differently for someone is if they are just planning a trip over the course of a summer. Then weather and seasons are less of a factor, and you just have to be prepared for whatever it is you're going to face in that area at that time. In this case, your goals and your route might be built upon getting you and your horses to a series of specific locations. Now, a common phrase that we hear is it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And that is true while you are doing the ride. However, while you are planning it, that is not true at all. It is about the destination. Figuring out point A to point B is a lot easier if you know where B is, and take it from someone who very often set out on his horses not knowing where he was going to be ending for the night. I've dealt with that plenty. It is far easier, and you can set up far more effective routes if you have your endpoint predetermined. One way that a long-distance pack journey differs from just a regular pack trip with your horses is the uncertainty. I spent the night at over 300 different locations. You cannot pre-plan for that many places. And part of the reason for this is the longer the trip that you go on, the more likely you are going to need to adjust course. One example of this is prior to leaving on the trip, I had intended to spend most of the month of March crossing the state of Tennessee. After this, I would pass directly into North Carolina, making Tennessee state number 10 and North Carolina number 11. However, after crossing the Mississippi and spending my one night in Kentucky, I discovered it was far more efficient to spend most of my time passing through the state of Kentucky eastward straight into Virginia, then dropping down, just touching North Carolina. This made Virginia our 11th state and North Carolina number 12, and I found this to be much more efficient in my case. The lesson here is the longer the trip, the more you have to be able to think on your feet. I typically did not know where my horses and I would be staying in a particular night more than a week in advance, and very often it was no more than 2 or 3 days in advance. Sometimes it was the same day. Now, this is less of a concern if, say, the goal of your trip is to camp entirely on public lands. Now, while public lands are not necessarily just a free-for-all for camping with your horses in the United States, it is very often the best we have to work with, especially in the Intermountain West, particularly where I started and ended the trip here in my home in the Rocky Mountains. Now, there's urban areas almost everywhere you go in the United States, but the more east you move in the continental U.S., the more urban it generally is. Now, the navigational tools that I'm going to share next are going to be useful whether you are out in the high country and national forest, staking your horses out every night without cell service, or if you are just riding from town to town, trying to find the least busy roads through the farmland. These are going to be useful to you no matter what. First, we're going to talk about GPS. Now, there's lots of good GPS tracking devices out there. This is one of those things, guys, where you get what you pay for. Now, for the entire trip, I used a Garmin InReach Mini 2. Now, this device has lots of different features, and if you want to know more of what those are, go check out this video where I go over 15 essential gear items, including this Garmin InReach, and I talk about some of its other specific features. First, let's talk about the tracking feature. Now, because of satellite positioning in this device, you are always able to see where you are located on the map. When people asked if I ever got lost, the answer was always no, because I could always look at the Garmin and see where I was. Now, this device connects through Bluetooth to an app on my phone. It was on this app that I would not only set up my courses that I was about to go and do, but also track the activity that I was actually currently doing. This allowed me to efficiently calculate my distance for my planned routes, as well as know the distance that I was accomplishing at the end of each day. I would also use the waypoint feature to mark where my ending points were. This would allow me to calculate the distance of multiple possible routes to figure out which one would be best. Not to mention, if my phone ever did die, I was still able to track the waypoint using only the Garmin device. Now, while Garmin's base layer maps on the app are not perfect by any means, I found them fairly visually useful and often handy for finding trails and side roads that were non-existent on other maps. Like I said, yes, there's other devices out there, but for me on this trip, the features on the Garmin were hard to beat. It was because of this device that I was able to gather the data for every day of this trip. Now let's talk about some other apps. The first one I want to mention that I used is Gaia GPS. Now this app allows you to download and add on base layers so that you have more on-hand information when you are in a remote location. Now many of you might be familiar with the app OnX. These apps are very similar. They have a lot of the same features. There are a couple key differences, but one of the main ones that I was after is there isn't an insane overhead subscription with Gaia. It's a lot cheaper for the annual subscription with Gaia GPS compared to OnX. I know that some people prefer OnX for specific activities like hunting, but I used Gaia for just a few specific things on this trip. The number one thing was the land use map. Having this map layer allowed me to see property ownership. I could see whether it was public or private, and if it was public, it would tell me whether it was state, Forest Service, BLM. If it was private, I could see if it was under the name of an individual or a specific corporation. This was useful for a variety of reasons, but especially for finding places to camp with my horses on public lands. I also found Gaia very useful for defining trail systems and roads on public lands. It was also handy for finding water sources in desert country, not to mention it had a feature that would tell me my current elevation. Now the last app that I want to talk about that I really relied on this trip is Google Maps. You can learn a lot from Google Maps, especially if you're trying to ride in more populated areas. I would use 3D Street View all the time to determine whether a certain bridge or highway or path was going to be safe for me and my horses. On top of that, the route finding feature set to walking can be really effective for finding the most efficient ways to get from point A to point B. I would cross-check most of the routes that I'd prepare in the Garmin app with Google Maps. This would give me a second source to compare to be able to determine what might not be real. Now guys, pretty much everything I've just discussed requires my cell phone. Now my GPS and my phone not only have batteries that can die, you can also lose or break these items. I used these methods the entire trip, and it worked for me. But long before I got high-tech, when I was a kid, I learned how to use paper maps. Now I know some guys that paper maps is the only way they do their navigation, and I respect it, but it is not efficient. Especially thinking about having to fold out a map while sitting up on your horse every time you want to try and make a decision about whether to go left or right. Not to mention they are a pain in the wind and the rain. But for all that, they don't have battery life that can die, and they work perfectly well without cell service. I kept paper maps of every single state that I went through. There's some things about old school you just can't beat, so for me that was my backup in case the electronic methods were to fail me. You can get pretty good trail maps for almost every state. I'll drop some links below so you guys can go find some of the ones that I've used. Now, one of the last useful tips I want to give you guys in this video is if you're going to ride horse in territory you're unfamiliar with, go speak with someone who has ridden in that area before. On the Year of the Mustang, I met thousands of people along the way, and I spoke with many of them about the places where they lived. I once changed a couple days worth of riding, simply because I had multiple locals warn me about a particular stretch of highway that they didn't recommend I be on with horses. Now, if you're someone who lacks those connections and is trying to get out more on the trail with their horses or is trying to go on pack trips, there's a lot of resources. I recommend getting into Facebook groups. There's a lot of trail riding groups and organizations that share this info with each other online. One specific organization that helped me out a lot on the Year of the Mustang journey is the Backcountry Horsemen Groups of America. The Backcountry Horsemen has chapters in many, many different states and sometimes even multiple in certain states. So you can look up those Facebook groups by the state that you live in, whether that's Iowa or Utah. All right, guys, obviously there's so much more I can talk about related to this topic. I plan on putting more videos out so that we can inform you guys on things like how to camp with your horses, how to be safe on the roads with your horses, things that will help prepare you guys to get out there on horseback. If you enjoyed this video, we also made a video that is 5 things you need to know to plan a horseback journey. So check that out as well. If you guys enjoy our stuff, please subscribe because like I just said, we're putting videos out every single week here on this channel. So if you want to support as well, you can go to yearthemustang.com and you can get yourself some merchandise, or you can donate or leave a super thanks on YouTube. It all helps us put these videos out. Thank you guys so much. Until the next one, adios.